Hi, I'm Tim Gillingham, your host for Gold Tips Aero University. The subject today is building an arrow for Fita or field style archery. Now, there's a couple different things that we need to take into consideration. One thing you're going to find out in Fita and field archery, we're going to be using much smaller diameter arrows, okay? Something like the Gold Tip Kinetic or a Gold Tip Ultralight or even a Gold Tip Pro Hunter. These all make exceptionally good Fita and field arrows. The basic thing that we want to look at is how does weight affect wind drift. Wind drift is a big factor when we're dealing with Fita archery. Not as much of a factor in field archery because we're in the woods typically, but it can be. So we need to take these into consideration when we're dealing with the elements. Another thing that you want to take into consideration is glance outs, okay? If you're shooting a larger arrow like this Gold Tip X Cutter, you know, it might be enticing to shoot a larger arrow to catch lines like we do indoors, but because we're typically shooting groups of arrows into targets, you know, you're going to get a lot of collision off the back of these pin knock bushings or unibushings, and it's going to cost you points based on glance outs. If you're going to shoot a larger arrow for field archery, I would recommend something like a Series 22, you know, with a longer knock like the GT Nock and a unibushing. It'll provide a little bit less of a glance out, but typically you're going to want to stick to the Ultralight, the Kinetic, or the Pro Hunter line. Okay, first let's start with Fita archery. It depends on the type of Fita organization you're shooting in or type of event you're shooting in. Most Fita USAT events nowadays are 50 meters. Now, if you're only shooting 50 meters, it has a little bit different parameters than if you're shooting all the way out to 90 meters. Typically in Fita events, the main thing, one of the big things you have to deal with is wind. Now, personally, I think wind affects the archer much more than it does the projectile. But what I've learned over the years is that in the wind, weight rules, okay? Weight is the thing that you want to maximize the most. And my typical parameter is whatever, I want to shoot as heavy of an arrow as I can shoot 270 feet per second. Now, why you say 270, what's the holy grail there? Well, I've found that 270 feet per second, right in that range. Now you can go 10 foot either way. You know, you can go up to 280 or you can go down to 260, but if you'll maximize the weight of the arrow, it's going to perform a lot better in a wind situation than speed will. Just because speed gets the arrow to the target sooner, it doesn't perform as well in the wind. Weight's going to resist the wind blowing on it, and it's going to give you a lot better downrange performance. So 270 foot a second is a really good threshold that I found, especially for field and Fita archery. If somebody mismarks a target or you miss a cut a little bit on an up or a downhill shot, a little bit of speed in that scenario is going to help you, and that's why I say 270 feet per second. Now, we have to, establish first, what weight arrow out of your bow shoots at that speed parameter, okay? So if you're my size, it might be a 460 grain arrow. I shoot a 460 grain arrow at 270 feet per second, okay? If you're a shorter draw length and you're, depending on the bow you're shooting, you want to figure out what weight arrow does it take to get 270 feet per second. And based off of that, we're going to configure an arrow for you. A couple things you want to take into consideration is point weight. Point weight's pretty big when we're dealing outside. The primary reason point weight is a big deal outside is because we're shooting arrows into groups. A heavier point weight's not going to glance off as bad, and a heavier point weight is going to help you when you're shooting a really small fletching like we see here. Now, we really have a requirement to shoot a smaller fletching for longer distance shooting. And the reason is that we want to eliminate some of the drag effect caused by the fletching. Now, if you watched the previous lesson on 3D archery and indoor archery, we opted for much larger vanes. Now, that's because we were shooting shorter distances. As we go longer and longer, we're going to have to keep that drag effect down, so we want to stabilize the arrow by adding a higher FOC. Most of our top field and Fita archers are shooting very heavy points, over 120 grains in the front of their target arrows. Personally, I shoot 140 in a Kinetic 300, and I also have a set of Pro Hunter 300s built up with 170 grains. Those are the two arrows that I'm going to run this year. A lot of our archers typically are running a 400 ultralight like you see here with a 100 grain base point, and then they're using the weight system with a 50 grain weight or even up to 70 more grains in the front of the arrow. What that does is it stabilizes the bare shaft and allows you to get away with a little bit smaller fletching. It makes it more forgiving. If we look over here to the spine chart behind me, you also want to be a little bit more closer to the recommended spine when you're dealing with a field or a Fita arrow, simply because we're running a small vane. We don't have that extra correction on the back, so we want that arrow to be a little softer and a little bit more forgiving for us. So we want to make sure that you use the spine chart to make sure you're stiff enough, but you want to kind of lean towards the edge of more optimal and what the spine chart recommends when you're dealing with a field and a Fita arrow. Now, fletching configuration can be all different kinds, but what we're looking for is lowering the side profile. Like I want a low side profile here to the wind, but I also want to maximize my correction, okay, and eliminate my drag effects. So a lot of times it takes a little bit of experimentation. You might try a VaneTech vane like this 1.8 super spine. Now a vane that's cut off in the back like this is going to create a little bit less drag, but it's also going to create a little less control. So it just takes a little experimentation. You might want to try, a pattern like this 1.5 vane or a 1.75 or even a 1.8. You're going to find minor differences in this, and it's going to show up at longer distances. If you get too small of a vane, what happens is you just lose control, and your misses are penalized, or your bad shots are penalized a little bit more than they should. So by going up to a little bit bigger vane, say to 2.25, you can see which one is going to be the most forgiving for you. Typically what I do is I'll fletch 3 arrows one way, 3 arrows another way, 3 arrows another way, and I'll go to the longest distance that I'm going to be shooting, and I'll shoot for groups, and I'll find out which one of these setups groups the very best. Then I'll go ahead and find a good day with wind, and I'll shoot them in the wind and see how they perform in the wind. Now, one thing you'll find is a little bit more vane in the wind is actually going to group better. And the reason is because it's controlling the back of that arrow. It's keeping the back of the arrow, in line with the front of the arrow. Okay, 2 things cause an arrow to plane offline: the point moving one way and the fletching following it. If we have more fletching, it keeps the arrow in line with the point, so therefore it can't plane. More heavy point weight out front also resists that planing motion, so it's going to be more forgiving in the long run. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about building an arrow for field archery. Now there's a couple different types of field archery in the world of archery. In Fita, you have unmarked archery. Fita field archery is unmarked, and in NFAA archery, it's all marked distance. So marked distance versus unmarked is 2 different parameters, really. If I'm setting a bow up for the unmarked side, I'm probably going to want to set up a little bit more speed. I might want to go past that 270 threshold. When you're dealing with a field, an NAA field style format, you have usually steep up and downhill cuts. A lot of times in NAA, they do not allow you to use angle meters and inclometers, so it's a little more of a guesswork involved. So a little more speed, just like in IBO and 3D archery, is going to benefit you in that scenario. But if you're shooting typical NFAA archery in the United States, or you're shooting marked distance IFAA archery, you're going to want to basically take the same parameters that we use for field archery or for Fita archery. You're going to want a heavy shaft. You're going to want something with a medium diameter like this Pro Hunter. It's typically shot in the woods, so you don't have to deal with wind a lot. But again, I like to set that thing up as heavy with a heavy point at 270 feet per second. I'm probably going to opt more for a unibushing like you see here with a longer nock, because I have a little bit shallower angle of approach and I'll get less kiss outs. Now, the pin nock is a really good option here also. You notice the pin nock doesn't provide much contact space on the bushing either, but these unibushings have been designed just to prevent glance outs in general. So you can choose the pin nock or the G-nock bushing style option, whichever one you like, but if you do shoot a push-in nock in the back of the shaft, just keep in mind you're going to break a lot of shafts when you're shooting groups. Too many people get overly concerned in field archery about arrow diameter. Arrow diameter is really not a big deal. The ultralight, I think, is really one of the more optimal diameters for field archery, and some of the best scores that I've ever shot in field archery have been with a medium diameter arrow similar to this ultralight 300 here, okay? You can go to a smaller diameter like a kinetic, like this 500 spine kinetic here, but a lot of times, you know, I find that a real ultra small diameter can be a little bit more critical. You know, it doesn't catch you the lines, and you should use as large a diameter arrow as you can get away with without losing points to glance outs. We're only shooting out to 80 yards in field archery, so you know, give yourself an arrow that's heavy, give you a good heavy point weight in the 120 to 150, 160 grain point weight range, and keep your speed up to around 270 foot per second, and I think you're going to find really good results in the field.